Mm. Okay, well, let me begin. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Marc Mamigonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. Thank you for finding the time in your day to join us for this program, which is called Getting at the Truth, Academia, Activism, and the War on Armenia, or Armenians. It's hard to say it out loud because there's parentheses. Before we start, I would like to just make a few brief announcements of upcoming events, which we hope will also be of interest to you. On this coming Saturday, March 27th at 5:30 p.m., journalist Tatul Hakopian will present his new book entitled in Armenian Mahvan Hovit, in English, Valley of Death, a 44-day catastrophe. This is organized by St. Leon Armenian Church in New Jersey, who will also be having a limited number of in-person attendees, but it will also be on Zoom and YouTube. And it is co-sponsored by the NAASR Gulbenkian Contemporary Issues Series and other organizations. On Sunday, March 28th, we will have a screening of the documentary Photos by Kirk by Jamie Day Fleck, followed by a discussion with the filmmaker, Jamie, Ruth Tomasian of Project Save, Sevag Yagoyan, and myself. This is co-sponsored by Project Save and NAASR. On Tuesday, April 13th, James Robbins will discuss his recently published book, When We Dead Awaken, Australia, New Zealand, and the Armenian Genocide. And this event is co-sponsored by NAASR and the Society for Armenian Studies. On Tuesday, April 20th, Umit Kurt will discuss his new book, The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. And this is presented by the Columbia Armenian Center, NAASR, and Research Institute on Turkey. On Thursday, April 22nd, Professor Harry Hartunian will give the inaugural Raymond H. Kevorkian Armenian Genocide Commemoration Lecture organized by the UCLA Richard G. Hovhannissian Chair and co-sponsored by NAASR and other groups. Professor Hartunian is the author of the book, The Unspoken as Heritage, the Armenian Genocide and its Unaccounted Lives. And on Friday, April 23rd, Joachim Savelsberg of the University of Minnesota will speak on his book, just published, Knowing About Genocide, Armenian Suffering and Epistemic Struggles, presented by the Society for Armenian Studies and the NAASR. So it's a busy month ahead of us. We are grateful to you for joining us for any or all of them. And for those of you who can't make them live, fortunately, there's YouTube afterwards. So thank you for checking out all of these programs. And thank you to all of the wonderful organizations that we have the opportunity to partner with on these events. Regarding tonight's event, I want to recognize and thank the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for their ongoing support of NAASR's Contemporary Issues lecture series, of which this is an installment. A reminder to please use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit questions. I see one person already has, so that's quick. Maybe there's a question about my announcements. I'm not sure, but I'll check that out as soon as I can. We will get to as many questions as possible after the more formal part of the program. Please, as always, make your questions succinct and on subject. We don't have the luxury of reading long statements or observations, however interesting they may be. Okay. Denial and distortion, whether of the Armenian genocide or of other fundamental facts of history relating to Armenia and Armenians, has long been a reality that academics and activists alike have had to deal with. It takes the form of aggressive fabrications by Turkey or Azerbaijan and their supporters, denying the genocide or lying about the destruction of thousands of Khachkars in Old Julfa. It takes the form of media both-sidesism and its tendency to create false equivalences, a phenomenon on full display during last fall's war, and nowhere more clearly, for example, than in the New York Times reporting on the war. But a phenomenon nonetheless that we're familiar with through long experience. Journalists, and indeed many historians, would have it that the truth exists in the middle. Denial and distortion seek to shift the perception of where that middle lies, and often succeed through sheer persistence and volume. The proliferation of denialist and counterfactual materials on the internet and social media, as well as in traditional media and academia, and the increased investment in creating ever more sophisticated misinformation is not a sideshow to the military aggression of Azerbaijan and Turkey that was on full display in the fall 2020 Artsakh war. Rather, it is a well-integrated and essential part of an overall effort to discredit, if not eradicate, Armenia and Armenians. It's always been clear that the very things Turkey and Azerbaijan most vociferously accuse Armenia and Armenians of, genocide, aggression, falsification, intolerance, are the very things they are engaged in. In my ignorance, I did not know until rather recently that there is a name for this phenomenon, Darvo, D-A-R-V-O, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender roles. It's an acronym. I guess there's an acronym for everything, and now I can add this one to my vocabulary. I recently read an article by Sarah Harsey and Jennifer J. Fried, who was the inventor of this term, published in the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma last year. In the article, the authors, writing about perpetrators of interpersonal violence, not genocide or forms of mass violence, show that, quote, participants who were exposed to Darvo perceived the victim to be less believable, more responsible for the violence, and more abusive. Darvo also led participants to judge the perpetrator as less abusive and less responsible. At the same time, Darvo educated participants perceived the victim as less abusive and more believable, and rated the perpetrator as less believable. These experiments show Darvo effectively reinforces the distrust of victims' narratives, but education can reduce some of its power. Academics and activists each contribute to this educational effort by presenting the truth about Armenian history and present-day issues. And as an aside, the truth does not mean painting a rosy picture of Armenians or papering over negative or questionable actions by Armenians. The truth is the truth. It would be difficult, I think, to look at the past 6 months and come to the conclusion that everything is running smoothly. My purpose and the purpose of this program is not to look down from some lofty height and declare the scholars have failed, or the advocates have failed, or Armenia has failed, or the diaspora has failed, etc. Each brings a set of strengths and limitations. Each speaks to a particular, though overlapping, constituency, and each faces the challenge of being proactive rather than merely reactive when it comes to facing the threat of denial and distortion. There's ample finger-pointing going on without our presenting it tonight. The point is to learn from past failures and past successes and to emerge smarter and more effective. We believe this is possible through serious discussions like this and by working together, and we're committed to that. So, we are fortunate, having said all of that, to have a panel of 4 experienced and knowledgeable individuals who are well equipped to discuss these and other issues. Our panel consists of Bryan Ardouny, who serves as Executive Director of the Armenian Assembly of America, Aram Hamparian, who serves as Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, Dr. Christina Maranci, the Dadian and Oztemel Professor of Armenian Art and Architecture at Tufts University, and Dr. Henry Theriault, President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University. To all of you, thank you for joining us. And the way we're going to proceed is this. We have a series of questions that we're going to pose to the panelists. We'll hear from them, we'll work through our list, and then we will give them the opportunity to add anything, and then we'll open it up for questions, of which I see we now have 2. So, you have all been involved in efforts to counter genocide, denial, and historical falsification, and to promote facts about Armenia and Armenians for many years now. Given the stakes, and given the recent disaster, both in the war and in the PR messaging department, the current moment seems to call for a different kind of approach. Do you agree? And if so, what might be the best way for us to move forward? And for the first question anyway, we'll go alphabetically, and we'll start with Bryan with an A, Ardouny.
All right, Marc, thank you so much, and welcome to everyone watching, and certainly our panelists. It's great to see everybody. To your question, I would agree that the stakes are high. There's no doubt about it. And reflecting on when I first started at the Armenian Assembly of America, there were less than half of the states that had resolutions affirming the Armenian genocide. And you had those in Congress that questioned the veracity of the Armenian genocide, and you had others that would say, now is not the time because of whatever reason they picked. And you see that we've come a long way from that point. Today, nearly every state has recognized, affirmed the Armenian genocide. And of course, the historic passage in 2019 in the House and the Senate of the Armenian genocide resolutions. So what is needed? What do we need to do? We need to continue our efforts. We need to step up our efforts in standing for the truth. We need to make sure that our voices are heard loud and clear, and especially this year with a new Congress and a new administration. And of course, you're having this panel discussion in March, and April is around the corner with everyone certainly focused on what's going to happen in April. So what does it mean? It means increased activism. It means increased outreach to elected officials. It means more coalition building, and it means more resources to be in the equation so that we can all. I'm speaking more for the advocacy portion of it, so that we can do even more work.
Thanks, Bryan. Aram. You're muted, Aram.
I would agree with everything that Bryan just shared. He's right on the mark. And Marc, thank you for this for organizing this program. It's an honor to be on with all of you. We definitely need to take a careful look at what we've done, where we've fallen short, and how we need to up our game. Traditionally, I think that in the advocacy world, we tend to engage with the American foreign policy establishment, with decision makers on three different planes. The first is the geopolitical plane. How do, let's say, Armenia's interests align with American interests? How do you deal with the Russia, Iran, Caspian Energy, NATO, Syria, Israel, all these various players? How does Armenia align with U.S. interests or not align with U.S. interests? That's a geopolitical level. And I think that ultimately the geopolitical decision makers in the U.S. government felt that Armenia was not sufficiently aligned, or was on the wrong side of sufficient number of issues, that when Armenia came under attack, there really was almost no defense of Armenia. It was almost entirely indifference. A second plane we operate on is more, let's say, civilizational or cultural. We talk about freedom, faith, Armenia's maybe rich tradition of democracy, Armenia's early adoption of Christianity, things of that nature, and that's a civilizational plane which we've expanded, I think, as a community. Our advocacy has really, I think, broadened those relationships. But what we found ultimately was that they were insufficient to persuade the geopolitical practitioners to side with Armenia or to defend Armenia in any meaningful way. So that's another painful lesson. I think the third plane of engagement for our community is constituency, right? Is the constituency plane, which is, we're American stakeholders. We pay our taxes, we vote in elections, we donate to friendly candidates, things of that sort. And I think that's where we have the most control, but also that proved insufficient to move U.S. policymakers. There was certain peculiarities in the previous administration, but ultimately, these are where we fell short. I would also add that in terms of rethinking our advocacy, and this is a discussion maybe we can explore later, is that we've largely been moral and aspirational. We have said, America aspires to this, but it's actually doing this. There's a gap between where we are and where we should be. Let us fill that gap. Let us do the right thing in terms of democracy for Artsakh or justice for the Armenian genocide. And that's gotten us places, but didn't get us where we needed to go last fall. So I would say perhaps a more clear-eyed look at the actual security of Armenia, and maintain the moral positions that we have on all these important issues, but also focus on what will make Armenia secure. I think that's an important takeaway from this experience.
Thank you. Christina. Oh, Henry.
Sorry, no, that's fine. I just have of course the phone is ringing just as I started to do that. Okay, I'm good. Okay, so and thank you, Marc, so much for this, and thank you to NAASR. So from a scholar's perspective, it's important to recognize that scholarship traditionally moves slowly. We take years to publish. Scholars, at least in this part of the world, do a lot of questioning and thinking and pondering and deliberating. And we learn languages, and we do all the things that take years and years to make us wise. And that's how scholars generally function. And what we're being asked to do now, particularly Armenologists, is for some of us anyway, rather different. And I think it is happening. So going from the long-term, long-haul work of scholarship, many of us are now serving in working groups that are dedicated to providing authoritative or credible content, source-based content on let's say, Artsakh, for example, that can be used by advocates, that can be used by the church or by in the legal sphere. Or by NGOs or by heritage organizations. So I think that's happening. And I have to applaud my colleagues for doing the work they're doing, because all of this is on top of, as I said in a recent other event, all of this is on top of what they normally do, because we all need to get promoted, we all need to get tenure and all that stuff. So I have seen, among my colleagues, just a tremendous redoubling of energy and effort towards this. But it is something that we're all learning as we go. And on top of that, Artsakh is not traditionally a very well-studied region in terms of its medieval history and in terms of its monuments and in terms of its archaeology. It's nothing compared to what we see, in the north and west in medieval Armenia. So there's a huge learning curve that's happening there too. So I think, I don't have any quick answers for how we should change what we're doing and move forward, but I think that obviously, alongside the sustained work of scholarship, what we are doing, which is essentially supporting and informing advocacy organizations and the like, is a positive thing. I'm happy to hear, though, if people have recommendations for how scholars can participate in these efforts that we're not already doing. It would be very useful. So thank you.
All right to jump in? Great.
Yes, please, Henry.
So I would follow up all of these really important comments by maybe pointing out four challenges that we have to overcome, if I can say that, in changing our approach. The first one was actually pointed out to me by Vahan Babakanian, who started emailing me over last summer after the first attack, when the attack on Armenia happened by Azeri troops. And knew I was a genocide scholar and so forth, and although I've touched on the Artsakh issue and in different areas and given a paper or two on it, it hasn't been a focus of mine. I'm not an expert on the area, and he pointed out that having weighted so much focus on the genocide has really been disadvantaging the Armenian cause, if you want to say it that way, or the defense of Armenians relative to Artsakh, because it's really, again, not to get into that argument, should you focus on the genocide or Artsakh, which is a false dichotomy, but rather that people were not, connecting, we're not talking about Artsakh. And it really has made, and I didn't get it at the time as much as I should have. I knew he was right, but I didn't really follow that as much as I should have as a scholar at the time. And within 5 months, I'm sorry, not 5 months, within 3 months, we saw what was happening. And I think that's made me understand better. And in the work I'm doing in genocide studies, it's caused me to shift that quite a bit when I talk about Armenia, but when I talk about other cases as well, to understand the links between a genocidal past And contemporary geopolitics, economics, culture, identity, you know, all these impacts of the genocide. I mean, there's a reason why Azerbaijan had the advantage in the war that it did. Part of that is just demographics. Instead of 20 million Armenians in a large republic, which we might project had, you know, Richard Hovhanessian said, even if the genocide had happened, if the republic had been left alone, you would be seeing that kind of a state today. We had, you know, optimistically 3 million, right? We have a totally different geopolitical situation. We have a totally different, you know, cultural identity, you know, prominence in the world, political relevance. Armenia is marginal in terms of global culture, in terms of global politics, in terms of global economics. Armenia as a republic, as a state, and as a global diaspora, I think it is really marginal, as much as we might want to think otherwise. And that's a direct result of the different factors or the different impacts of the genocide. So connecting those two things, understanding that what happened in Artsakh is not just a part ideologically of what happened, but it's a result of the material, demographic, political, military, and other shifts that happened at the time. The second thing I would suggest is a real rethinking of Armenian machismo. You could really talk to people in Armenian and other places. You could see this for years. This kind of thing, we'll handle anything. We will just deal, let the Azeris come, we'll deal with it. A very unrealistic way of thinking, but also a kind of militaristic, combative way of thinking. We will just fight and it'll be fine. And almost a sort of action hero at times approach. I saw this, there was a rally in Boston at the beginning of the war, and a lot of people were somber appropriately about what was happening and concerned, but there were some Armenians who were kind of treating it like a pep rally. And I was stunned by that. We already knew Armenians had died, but there wasn't a realistic understanding of what war is and the need, especially for a small vulnerable group, to find alternatives to it. Even winning, and even if had we won, that wouldn't, I mean, it would be good in protecting Armenians, but there would be consequences of that we needed to take seriously. The third thing I would say is a kind of self-ghettoization of Armenians in social justice movements, a lack of connection to other struggles. You mentioned St. Leon's has an event coming up. They also organized through the wonderful Aras that many people will know, a great event on Black Lives Matter for Armenians last summer. And there was a lot of pushback on that. Zorovig in Boston also organized a similar thing. A lot of pushback by Armenians on the idea that Armenians should focus any attention on other struggles. And the contradiction is obvious. Why do you think any other group is going to care about your issues if you're telling them point blank their issues don't matter, right? Instead of finding the commonalities that we share with so many other groups, that was a real problem. And then the final thing, and I think maybe we'll talk about this later, or we can come back to it later in the question and answer if there's time, because there's too much to go into, I think, right now, is we need to find a way to overcome a general academic prejudice against groups like Armenians having their scholars be considered legitimate scholars of an issue in the general academic setting, right? So Armenian scholars are tagged as Armenian scholars. And every Armenian scholar is somehow supposed to be a rabid nationalist whose work is instantly suspect, whether they have an IAN on their name or not, because of their national identity or their cultural heritage even. Some may not even consider themselves as part of a national group. This is a bias against Armenians. The idea that Armenian scholars can't be objective and thoughtful and challenging on issues is really just says, oh, Armenians are these sort of mindless drones, no matter how educated they appear. They're just spewing out prejudice and self-interested work. And the record is definitely not that. If you objectively evaluate Armenian scholarship or scholarship coming from Armenians, there is tremendously important work there that is clearly not biased in any significant way. So I would end with that, or with that point.
Yeah, you know, when I invited Christina and Bryan to participate, I thought they weren't Armenian, so we were going to get some subjective opinion. But it turns out they don't have the IAN, but they're actually Armenian. So I apologize for that. Thank you for making all of your points, and actually what Henry was just saying dovetails well with the next point, which I want to direct to Christina and Henry specifically. As academics, it's vital for you to maintain your integrity as scholars in your respective fields. At the same time, you each have on numerous occasions advocated for particular issues, such as the preservation of Armenian churches or other monuments, or reparations for the Armenian genocide, etc. How do you balance your scholarship and your advocacy, given the reality of perception that Henry has just very cogently spoken about, that anything you say as an Armenian about Armenian things may be held against you? Christina first, please.
Well, I'll just say from personal experience, I've never thought about it in the sense. I mean, I have an answer for this question, but I've never thought of that as a hindrance, and I've never felt it myself. And I just could be completely oblivious. I'm not on social media, and I don't hear that kind of noise, and that's probably for the good. But I could also just not be sensitive to it in some way. But so it's, now I'm wondering, how many times have I been, passed over because of this? So now I'll start thinking about that. Thank you. But just to think about the question, how do you balance your scholarship and your advocacy? And I think it's a really interesting question. For me, it's never been a question of balance. And again, it's felt very natural to me. It's not felt like even two distinct things. So I have a kind of multifaceted answer to this question. First of all, I'm a scholar. And when my archive is threatened, I feel I need to take steps. And that's what, in a way, I think of the churches. They are my archive. They're what I study. If I don't have them, I don't really have work to do. And so that's what happened with the Church of Maranci. I mean, I'm working on this church at home, reading everything I can, and then I find out that its south wall has come down. So what am I supposed to do? I don't see exactly how. For me, it wasn't a question of just letting it go. I felt that I had to step in at that point. That was complete for me. That it wasn't as though I turned on some kind of advocacy button and, there I am. No, this is an extension of me sort of working with my archive, in this case, protecting it. The second thing is, and someone was talking about this before, it's the idea that I consider myself an engaged member of the community. I give money to causes, I sign petitions, and whether it's about the presidential election or whether it's about Artsakh. So I see myself just as engaged, and to some extent, I think the advocacy is an extension on Artsakh and Armenian matters is an extension of that. I mean, it's, one can't really be passive, for example. Or at least I feel like I can't. And just taking this last presidential election it's a good example of what can happen when people turn out and are active. And the last thing I would say is that I am Armenian, and I am a granddaughter on both sides of genocide survivors. And so when Shushi was bombed, I remember my mother called me, and I don't think I ever want to hear her as upset as she was. It's a horrible thing. It is a personal matter. It was as though, and I think this was true for a lot of Armenians, as though she was reliving everything her parents lived through. And so there are all these dimensions, I think, to my engagement with scholarship and advocacy, and it's fluid and it turns every day depending on who's asking for what. But in the background, always for me, there has to be the long haul scholarly work that I mentioned before. So that's for me one of the biggest casualties that I think could be Azerbaijan has threatened us with, and that is the impoverishment of this kind of long tradition of scholarship that has been going on for centuries, So all of us have suspended or slowed down our book projects and our articles, trying to deal with what's happening now. So there is that's happening as we speak. And I'm just very cognizant of that. And I'm I'm trying to be vigilant about not letting that happen, not letting those research projects go. But this is all a kind of balancing act. So.
Thank you. Henry.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I have many times encountered people sort of, I won't say openly denigrating, but sort of dismissing Armenian scholars on issues of say, the genocide or something else. And in fact, even within Armenian circles, in planning events, I have heard people very often say, well, we really need a non-Armenian to say this.
We've all said it.
It reminds me, what's that?
We've all said it at one time or another.
Yes, and it reminds me of sitting in an audience a few years ago with a group of Native American scholars watching a presentation by a white identified person on Native American issues, a plenary presentation. And each of the Native American scholars sort of talking and joking, yeah, we've all been saying that for years, but when we say it, nobody listens because we're Native American scholars. And if we talk about Native American issues, we're immediately dismissed. But the white guy says it and it's legitimate, you know? And I think in Armenian circles, there's that attitude. If you can get a non-Armenian to say it, it's now real. Now people will take it seriously. And I think that's a problem. Let's face it, all scholarship is heavily interested. Scholars who claim disinterest are usually interested in their career, in their egos. Maybe they've got corporate backing, they're into the power. Some of them like the abusive enjoyment they get from their positions. Some are motivated by truth, social justice. Some just want to go with the flow, so they'll say what sort of conforms to prevailing ideas. And others, for career interests, want to say things that are outlandish, regardless of whether they're true or not, just because that gets them attention, it gets them published and so forth. I'm not saying, you know, and probably all these things are mixed up in every scholar at some level, right? So the idea that suddenly because you're talking about an issue that has real meaning, you know, has personal dimensions for you, it just seems, you know, it seems like a bad thought in the beginning, right? It's not a question of whether people are interested. It's a question of whether they make the effort and others are checking them to make sure their work is of good scholarly quality. Their methods are good, they're objective, they're not allowing personal wishes, desires, biases to infect their scholarship, right? That's the question. And if something's driven by ego, it can disrupt the scholarship just as much as a national agenda or anything else. So I think that whole framing of the question needs to be thought through. And really the implications are, do we want to say women can't write about sexual assault of women? You know, do we want to say African-Americans shouldn't be scholars of African-American studies, you know? And we don't, and yet each of the people, each of the groups I've mentioned and many more get confronted with this same question again and again and again about their legitimacy. So I think that's the first thing I would say. And I would say what we're really not doing is applying that framework to non-Armenians. I can just name, just looking at the press coverage around the around the war, and certain people who are, I won't say they're scholars, but are well-known somewhere in the journalist, writer category. Someone like Tom DeWall, who was embraced as this incredibly objective, you know, the ultimate authority on all this stuff, and yet whose work is riddled with, I mean, at times absurd, unjustified, often honestly pro-Azeri material. And no one, you know, or very few people have subjected people like that to scrutiny, where they subject our, you know, Armenians have to prove that they're legitimate scholars, yet these other people don't have to prove anything. They're just assumed because they claim and they talk about their objectivity again and again and again, that they're objective. I'm not saying, you know, and I want to be very clear, I check myself on this because I know I care about issues. But the other thing to say is, as much as passion for an issue or direct involvement in an issue, feeling it on your skin, so to speak, can open up problems, it also creates a kind of energy that can drive people to push past biases, to push past academic limits, to push toward new ways of understanding issues that can be incredibly productive. Great scholars of the Holocaust, many of them are Jewish people who were driven and would not give up in their lives because they wanted to understand what had happened. And that's why they could gain insight. It's because that passion drove them. It didn't make them biased or inaccurate. It made them better scholars. So I think I would end with that.
Thank you. To Aram and to Bryan, as advocates for Armenian causes in political and diplomatic circles, for example, does the effectiveness of your advocacy work, excuse me, depend on the factual reliability of what you are advocating for? And if so, how do you make use individually or as organizations that you represent of the work of scholars to bolster your efforts? And similarly, or in addition, what can scholars do in general to make your work more effective? Aram.
That's a great question, Marc. Let me before answering that, let me just put a quick comment on what Hank said. I'm reminded, Hank, by your remarks of Israel Charney's quote about the denial of genocide and how that represents a celebration of death, a reaffirmation of the doctrines that led to the deaths, and this idea that doctrine can be reasserted whenever it's convenient. And that speaks to ultimately the continuity of genocide. And I think that when we look at what happened last fall, it's very much a continuation of what was never really punished or was never really checked. That's number one. Number two, you talked about bias in scholarship. Totally agree. I would add to that bias in diplomacy. I just did a little math here, and I'm not an especially good mathematician, but I think that the percentage of Armenians who work in American diplomacy is something less than 1/2% of 1%. And we represent considerably more than 1/2 of 1% of the US population, but I think you probably count the number of Armenians at Foggy Bottom certainly on two hands, maybe at 1 foot. It's a very, very small number. And, I don't think that's an accident. I think that there are reasons for that are worth exploring. Okay, on the facts. The easy answer, and the answer I should give, the civics answer that I would give to a visiting group of students is, of course, right? The facts will lead you ultimately to the right solutions, that the truth will prevail, the truth will set us free. The sad reality is we've seen time and time again in American civic life that the facts are simply not enough. They're not enough. I'll give a few examples. The fact of South African apartheid didn't affect US policy for decades on end. The facts of global warming didn't affect US policy for decades on end. The facts of the harm of cigarette smoking, right, didn't affect US policy for decades. Ultimately, the work of grassroots interests, the American citizens, using facts, deploying facts, persuading people, building a movement, ultimately moved us toward a more sane policy, let's say on global warming, or the tobacco or smoking, or eventually on South Africa. It was a necessary ingredient to have the facts on our side, but sadly was not sufficient. And I'm going to be even a little bit more dark about this by saying that, and sometimes the truth fails. And sometimes, Hank mentioned about the Native Americans. We celebrate this year the first cabinet secretary who is an indigenous American, right? And that's a wonderful achievement. But the fact that we consider it a wonderful achievement that one person, after hundreds of years, gets to serve in one position while an entire multiple nations were disenfranchised, were driven from their homelands, right? That's how terrible the horrors that were visited upon the Native American people were. And the truth has always been on their side. Justice has always been on their side, but unfortunately not the political will. And as a result, we celebrate these small steps when, an entire peoples were destroyed. So the fact of the matter is that facts matter. You need the facts on our side. I think we've always been fortunate that certainly on genocide scholarship, there's never been a shortage of solid documentation, whether it's in the U.S. archives or at the Library of Congress or wherever you turn. I think that if this issue had been decided on its merits, let's say at some kind of very formal debate setting where points are, attributed for accuracy, this issue would have been resolved in the early 20s. But nonetheless, we had to fight it for basically a century, built upon the facts, built upon the moral arguments that we brought. But ultimately, it was ultimately a political issue, a political will that carried the day, along with some good timing. And that's just the way things work. So the facts are essential. We've been blessed with wonderful scholarship, but we've seen that it's sometimes not enough to be right.
Bryan.
Thank you. And in terms of the truth will prevail, I'm just reminded of another saying, truth held hostage. In fact, that obviously was a book by Ambassador Evans. Aram talked a lot about the facts and policy, and certainly policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Members of Congress, for example, they have access to experts and scholars, whether at think tanks or universities, as well as current and former diplomats. And these experts are routinely called upon to offer their views before Congress, expert testimony, et cetera. And certainly in the case of think tanks, they regularly circulate policy papers and hold think tank events, seminars, et cetera. And the same, as Aram was saying, the same is true for us. We don't work in a vacuum. We are looking at the facts. We look at what information is available to us, and certainly we are blessed that over the years there's been experts on genocide that have testified before Congress throughout the years, whether it's a Robert Melson, a Roger Smith, a Reuben Dadian, and of course many more. And these are all very important contributions that help shed more light on and bring more awareness to these issues. So, what scholars, can do to make work more effective. I would say that, scholars need to continue, as Christina is saying, and, they need to do their independent, and Henry too, their independent research. They have this information, and then it's incumbent upon us to be able to utilize that information, whether it's an Ambassador Evans and Truth Held Hostage, whether it's a Peter Balakian in the various books, Burning Tigris, et cetera, that he's done in his scholarship. I mean, that's what is available to us, and it's incumbent upon us to utilize it. And I would also say to Christina, for example, thank you for that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last year. Cultural heritage in the crosshairs or something to that effect, and really pointing out what's happening to some of these very historic cultural sites that maybe at least me, being so consumed and focused on certain policy initiatives and efforts in Congress, maybe wasn't focused particularly on that area. And now we certainly are focused on that area. So again, it's a constant effort, education, awareness, making sure that we have the latest reliable and accurate information. So I turn it back to you, Marc.
Thank you. Well, next question here. For many years, Turkey and its supporters have engaged in denial of the Armenian genocide, continuing it and in some ways intensifying it in the face of increased scholarship and international recognition. Azerbaijan has for some time been engaged in a parallel effort to deny and distort Armenian history, even to the point of discrediting Armenia's existence as a culture or as a nation. As scholars and advocates alike, how do you decide, or how do you know when and how to actively counter such work of denial and distortion, and when to simply ignore it or let it pass you by? Let's start with Henry, since he's muted.
Thank you. So I would say the first, the first thing it comes from a first realization comes from teaching an Armenian genocide course years ago, when a very astute graduate student pointed out to me about halfway through the semester that when I'm talking about different different works of scholarship we were reading and so forth, particularly on the history of the genocide, I would often talk about why the scholar had written something in a certain way or it included a certain detail. And I said, it's to counter this denial argument or in anticipation of this possible denial argument. And this was a Holocaust scholar, and she said, wow, I never would think of doing that for a Holocaust scholarship. We write the scholarship, and then when the deniers come, then we can deal with it. But you're already in a context of denial no matter what you do, right? So that makes it really difficult. The temptation is to get caught up in, internet discussions and other things, trying to fight with deniers, or whatever, or Zeri propagandists on Twitter, or whatever it is. That's never useful, in my opinion. You're not going to convince them. That's not the point. You may think, how can you say the genocide didn't happen? The evidence is overwhelming. That's not the issue at all. It's never about the deniers. It's always about observers. And so the first thing is, it is crucial to put out good scholarship about issues that are important to Armenians, especially when you can connect it to other issues. Artsakh has connections. It has colonialist dimensions. It has all sorts of other dimensions that need to be highlighted, right? It's about an indigenous group, right, that has been subjected to a colonization process that has had genocidal components and other things. That stuff needs to be put out there so that the facts are there. But then it's not simply enough to put that stuff out there. Aram, pointed this out. That's definitely not enough, because it's all about spin. We know this. It's all about how things are presented. You can fabricate things. If you fabricate, through 100 websites against the truth on one website, guess what people are going to believe? It's the 100 websites. We know that, right? But while you don't debate deniers, you don't have to respond to them directly. Once you have those facts out there, then you really have to apply psychological critique, ideological critique, and so forth to the propaganda, the Artsakh propaganda, to the genocide denial, and so forth. Going back to I can think of Charney as a good example of this. He didn't debate deniers. He analyzed the psychology of denial in the article that Aram was talking about, so he could expose it. He said, this is why people think this way. He didn't have a discussion. He did talk with deniers at some point, but he wanted to show people how mentality behind denial and what it was doing. And that's worth, I hate to say it, that's worth a million facts, because you've actually legitimized the facts that you have. Darvo is another great example, right? By exposing this mechanism, you suddenly make that the focus, not the facts, not the story of the victim. You're changing the discussion. Charney actually in that same article said that one of the objects of denial is to destroy the capacity of its targets to know what's true. And it does that not simply by falsifying facts, but by turning critical thinking back on itself. And I'll just point out before I finish, a great article by Terence Day Prade, pre-internet, 1986, in the Yale Review, I can't remember which one, called On Governing Narratives, and is a very sophisticated analysis of the mechanisms of Armenian genocide denial that could have been written last year in the full internet age. He's got all the elements. It really applies to what we're seeing. And he pointed out that the great problem with denial in the modern era is that it has appropriated what used to be very positive critical thinking tools and flipped them back on themselves into the service of denial. To deal with that requires very sophisticated work by people who are concerned about the truth, untangling all these mechanisms and offering observers outside of this an opportunity or the tools that they can use to actually make sense of all the conflicting information they're getting and to start to understand how they can get to the truth. It is really hard to do, though, and that's why, it's so easy to be a propagandist and it's so hard to fight propaganda. And we saw that, in the past 6 months.
Thank you. Bryan.
Thank you. You know, in terms of when do we decide and how do we counter it? I mean, it's an ongoing, almost every, you know, daily occurrence. It's something that we all face. And I look back, you know, 20 years ago to the consideration of, and Aram will know this well too, HRES 398, and then it became 596 when it went through committee, but it was a resolution back in 1999, 2000 on the Armenian genocide. And there was a subcommittee hearing before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Operations and Human Rights, chaired at that time by Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey. And at that time, you know, the efforts to thwart the resolution ranged from, you know, as Henry has talked about, the false equivalency arguments and wanting to hear both sides of the issue, and to stating that their concerns did not in any way lessen their concerns of, and then in quotes, of the slaughtering or killing of the Armenians in that period of time in our world's history. Or from the then Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, that the quote unquote, that the administration opposes legislative measures to deal with the sensitive issue raised in HRES 398. So we have faced the gambit of the tactics, and I could go on, but I'll stop here and just note that it, you know, it sort of feels like that commercial where, you know, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. So anyway, I'll turn it over. There's so many different stories in terms of all these approaches and tactics. And it's just, again, we just have to confront it and utilize the facts and marshal our resources and let people know the truth. And that's what we do.
Aram.
I would agree with Bryan that it's basically a judgment call, case by case, understanding when it's advantageous to engage and when it's not. Sometimes some especially egregious examples of denial are good foils, and actually they serve a useful purpose because they can help educate third parties about what's happening. Other times it's best to just sort of let the pitch go by and not take a swing. I would say that the governing principle for us in the advocacy world is, you know, what serves our aim. Now, in the academic world, it's the search for truth, right? We follow the truth where it leads us. That's certainly the powerful ethic behind scholarship, and it's as it should be. Our world is a little different. You know, we are basically looking at a survival strategy. You know, how can we contribute to the continued existence of this, you know, genocide survivor state, this blockaded, landlocked, partition republic of, you know, 3 hopefully million people, you know, whose existence is at risk, that are placed at the table of nations, you know, could very easily in a day's time, a week's time, a month's time, be erased. So we would look and say, like, okay, truth important, absolutely, it's foundation of our advocacy, but truth in service of what? We would say truth in the service of justice, right? Why justice? Well, justice because the Armenian people need security. Without security, there's no Armenia, right? And that security ultimately serves survival. So the logic would be something like truth in the service of justice, justice in the service of security, security because we want to survive. And that's our aim. And people can say that's political, and hell, maybe it is political, but it's the basic common sense instinct of any nation to want to exist, to share what it has to share with the world, to learn what it can learn from the world. We're not ready to be written off or erased. So I would say that when we look at a given instance, an attack on the truth or an attack on the facts, we would sort of use that as the benchmark and say, okay, does engaging here help or hinder our broader effort to promote the security and survival of the Armenian people?
Christina.
Yes. So I'm not a tactician or a strategist, but when I the question was about when and how to counter such work. And when it's about the monuments or the field with which I am most familiar and in which I do my scholarship, that is medieval art and architecture, Armenian art and architecture, then I will usually, if it seems like it's not going to be completely useless. So I think it's important for scholars to, like me, to work within your field of expertise. I mean, that maybe is common sense, but it's worth saying. And in the working groups that I've been in, there are historians, there are archaeologists, there are art historians. So that's just, that would be just a rule of thumb. But for now and for the past several months, I've tried to sort of say yes to as much as I can. That's really all I have to add to it.
And I would add that not every response needs to be or ought to be public. Sometimes these things can be done privately, depending on what one thinks the attitude of the person is. There's denial and distortion that can be done out of, let's say, ignorance rather than malice. And sometimes people can be reached that way and corrected and improved going forward. Sometimes not.
I think, can I just add one more thing? And that is something that I've always tried to stress with the monuments and the monuments at risk, is that there's a lot of efforts to do with cultural heritage, and it's a big entangled issue that many people are interested in, and it's becoming important in an Armenian sphere too. But it's easy to lose sight of the fact that what one hopes for, what I hope for, is just that the monuments survive intact. Because again, with heritage matters, it can get to be very fun to talk about the potential diplomatic positive things that come out of a heritage project, whether it's at Ani or whether it's in, wherever, in Artsakh. But what matters at the end of the day is that the monuments stand and intact. And that's, because long after we're gone, what we'll have, or what hopefully our children will have, will be those monuments or those volumes of scholarship that are sitting at NAASR on the shelves. Those things will last. So anyway, but in terms of the monuments, long-term health of the monuments, their stability is the most important thing. And that includes their inscriptions, by the way. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. So focusing on one matter for the moment, both the quality and quantity of pro-Azerbaijani publications in print and on the web have increased significantly in recent years. As has been documented exhaustively by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, Azerbaijan has virtually no limit to what it will spend to influence authorities. Azerbaijan can draw on its friends in the petroleum industry and well-connected political figures such as those associated with the U.S.-Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce. What are the strengths of Armenia and of Armenians in the diaspora in the face of this? And I will ask Aram to speak first.
Okay, that's a great question. And the fact of the matter is, we're involved in a highly, dramatically asymmetrical situation. The sides could not be more different. They may be arguing over the sort of a global perception of the Armenian issue, but each side brings very, very different things to that process, let's say. As you said, Azerbaijan just needs to write checks. And they have the resources to write those checks, and they have the willingness to write those checks. And sometimes the money gets spent in foolish ways, and sometimes it gets spent in more effective ways. But the net effect of it, as they say, the quantity has a quality all its own, right? There's just a flood of money coming from Baku, also from Ankara, then their natural allies and the money that they bring and the political bandwidth that they bring, which in some ways dwarfs the actual money. but that's a separate issue. So that's what's on one side. So very little effort, very little commitment involved other than just writing checks. The Armenian side, by and large, requires spirit, it requires faith, it requires devotion. And those are things that our community, the global Armenian nation, has produced, but at a cost, right? It takes, that's the work of Armenian moms and dads, that's the work of grandparents, that's the work of Sunday school teachers and scout leaders, and all sorts of people who wear multiple different hats in the Armenian world, who do their best to raise generations of young Armenians who care about their heritage, who want to see the Armenian nation survive and thrive on our planet. So that is the highly intensive effort undertaken almost entirely, with a few exceptions. I'll include Bryan and myself in there, almost entirely by volunteers. Like the vast 98% of Armenian political capital in America is produced by volunteers in their so-called free time after work and family and everything else. So it's just tremendously asymmetrical. And I think that as long as the Caspian produces enough sort of energy resources for Azerbaijan to have basically limitless spending, we're going to have to deal with that. What happens after that is something else. But yeah, this is just a recipe for, we need to step up our game. And the way we step up our game is, more resources, sure, but also our families and our community organizations, working even harder to inspire the next generation. That's where, if you trace back the Armenian influence on the planet, it's really just, an aggregation of a lot of Armenian families and a lot of Armenian community groups doing their absolute best, with many, distractions and many difficulties. But that's our army. Mer Panaga, Mer Kamavor Panaga, they say. Our volunteer army is up against just a very well financed opposition.
Oiled machine.
Yes, oiled machine, perfect. Yeah.
Bryan.
Thank you, and I would agree with what Aram said, and looking at the context, you mentioned the organized crime and corruption project in the question, I believe, and they exposed the Azerbaijani laundromat scheme, right? The $2.93 billion effort to whitewash their record, their human rights record in Europe, and there's no question that they'll spare no expense. We've all seen that, and certainly, and I'm not the best with math either, but if you add up all the budgets of all the various Armenian organizations, et cetera, I'm gonna guess that the budget is not $3 billion. So
I think your math is good enough. Yes.
Thank you. So, certainly one of our greatest strengths, obviously, is the resiliency of the Armenian people and the dedication and enthusiasm that everyone has here in the diaspora. And I think I just, since you're actually, is everyone except for Aram and I, are you all Massachusetts based? Yeah. So, okay. And so in the words of former Speaker Tip O'Neill, right? All politics is local. And I think, certainly commend the grassroots activism of the community from coast to coast to Boston in particular, et cetera. That's what it's about. It's about motivating and getting more people inspired, engaged in these issues to make sure that we're able to combat the very things we're talking about.
Henry.
Definitely second what's been said so far, and honestly, if we really think about it, as some other genocide victim groups, Armenians shouldn't exist today. If you look at not just the genocide, but the forces over the last 100 years that have been applied to destroying Armenian peoplehood and identity, we shouldn't exist. And the fact that we do is a testament to the things that Bryan and Aram have talked about. It reminds me of the Tasmanians in Australia, who were declared extinct as a people in 1876. And in the 1980s, suddenly young Tasmanians are saying, we're here, right? We're still here. And I think Armenians do that, like you don't give up. And that's a huge thing, especially when it's intergenerational. And I think Aram had mentioned sort of, grandparents to parents to children. That intergenerational connectivity is incredibly important in something I'll talk about in a moment. But it's incredibly important keeping those community bonds not just lateral in the same time, but keeping them over time, which is really important. I think this has been sort of alluded to, but Armenians, we're not mercenaries, right? The people who are doing this work are anything but mercenaries. It's kind of the anti-mercenaries, right? I mean, anyone on this panel, if you ever build somebody for the unpaid labor you've done on these issues, you would be super rich, right? You don't stop, there's something going on in Congress. Bryan doesn't stop at 4 and say, oh yeah, no, I'm done being Armenian. I'm going to be something else, for the next, 15 hours or whatever, right? So we're committing tremendously to this. And that's a huge difference. You only get what you pay for. And usually with mercenaries, you get less than that, right? Because they don't have a stake in what you're doing, even if they're part of your own country. Second thing is, I do not believe that the truth will out or we'll eventually get to the truth no matter what. Nothing like that. But truth is a really good advantage. I mean, having facts consistently on your side is really helpful when you're making a case. You don't have to keep making stuff up and changing your position, relative to this or that. It's the same stuff you're pointing out again and again and again. And that relates to legitimate historical claims. That honestly Turkish and Azerbaijani leaders, and I've always wanted to use this word in some kind of academic context, have conniptions over today. The Treaty of Sèvres causes people to break out in hives, right? Why? Because they know what's at stake. They know the truth, right? Yes, a lot of Azeris and Turks have been propagandized. They're drinking the Kool-Aid. I get that. But a lot know exactly what's at stake. They deny not because they don't believe that the genocide happened or believe that Armenians have a right to Artsakh, have lived there for 2,000 years. They know damn well that's the case. They deny out of an anger and resentment that these subhuman, victims who, should, who are the remnants of the sword, who are nothing, have the gall to assert their humanity and dignity and make a claim for historical truth, a claim for justice. And when Armenians do that, as with other groups, it really, I'll use the term, freaks out the perpetrator progeny because they are confronting something they can't just wish away. The last thing I'll say is time. To the extent that Armenians in Artsakh and with the Republic, and I have been on record as saying, some years ago, around reparations, that I didn't know that Armenia would exist in 50 years. I've moved that to 20 years now. I think there's a real question about whether Armenia as a state and Armenians as a viable people will exist after 20 years, given what we've just seen and the trends that we're seeing. That said, if Armenians beat that, right, we keep surviving no matter what, time is eventually on our side, not to quote the Stones, but and it's simply because denial after a while, propaganda after a while just can't be sustained. You keep, how many times can you recycle the same denial argument against the same facts that are presented, right? After a certain time, if people are dedicated to the truth, there can be an effect. And I would actually add that with time, on the Turkish and Azeri side comes impatience. Aliyev may be overplaying his hand in certain ways right now. He may have done too much militarily. He may have made Armenians too clearly the victims against a lot of the rhetoric he's trying to present and the petty garbage about Armenian POWs that's being practiced and the videos of mutilations of Armenians and this kind of stuff, kidnapping people. This kind of petty stuff that serves no geopolitical purpose actually in the long run can hurt Azerbaijan quite a bit because it really exposes the underlying attitudes that are driving this process. And you can even see this. Erdogan and Aliyev are blatantly genocidal in their rhetoric quite often. And that's a kind of impatience, right? They don't want to keep denying. They're getting tired of denying. Erdogan's had to do it for 54 years, or Erdogan and people like him have had to do it for 54 years actively. right? They're tired of it because they still have to do it. They don't have the dedication to the truth. And I think that eventually is really hurting them. Armenians, if we can, playing the long game really matters. And if it takes 50 years or 100 years, it's got to take that time.
Christina.
Yeah, just to follow along what Henry said, it needs to be stressed, and I'll just say this quickly, what we have in terms of an archaeological and a historical record over centuries, what Armenia has it's very unusual to have that. And although we maybe take it for granted because we've seen Khachkars before, but this to have 40,000 manuscripts, thousands of Khachkars, thousands of churches, thousands of inscriptions is very unusual, not to mention a 19th and early 20th century record of intellectual and historical production. And so that means we can go to somebody like Lalayan or Alishan and read what they said about Artsakh. So this is a tremendously, cumulative a kind of practice and process that Armenians have. So it's not just intergenerational, it's across the centuries. And I'm not trying to be reductive, but it's to point to this tremendous corpora of information, this incredible amount of material that we have to bring to bear on all these issues of advocacy, et cetera. I mean, this material is just waiting to be tapped. And that's where scholars come in as well.
Thank you. All right, the last question from me before we take some of the excellent questions from the audience. Let's take as a case in point the recent proclamation issued by the mayor of the city of Boston, or now ex-mayor, I guess, Marty Walsh, marking Khojaly Commemoration Day. While the mayor's office subsequently retracted the proclamation and apologized, obviously a far better situation would have been one in which the office knew beforehand about the Azeri and Turkish efforts and what lay behind them and rejected such a thing out of hand. That didn't happen. How can Armenian studies scholars and advocates and activists, this kind of brings us back to where we started, move beyond reacting to distortion, reacting to such moves, to a more proactive situation where denial and distortion are less likely to appear or to be effective in the first place? Who would like to start? Aram would, but he's muted.
I'll offer an answer, Mark. It won't be like extremely satisfactory. It's certainly not. It won't be to me, but I'll give you.
Take what we can get, Aram.
Okay, I'll be as truthful and forthright as I can be. I think I can speak for Bryan when I say that we're most proactive in the places that matter most, right? We do focus like a laser beam on legislative offices and the executive branch, particularly those aspects of those two branches of government that govern foreign policy toward the South Caucasus, the greater Middle East. So if it's with the most urgency that we seek to educate folks in those capacities. Then you go down from there to the other places that matter. Let's say legislators without a foreign affairs portfolio, or executive branch agencies that are in foreign affairs. Then you go to state governments and then municipal governments. And we want to be active in all those areas, but it's a question of prioritization. So is there a proactive effort in every municipality? I'm not sharing this with the world. Is there a proactive effort in every municipality across the country to educate them against doing this? At some level there is, right? Their efforts have been undertaken, educational efforts have been undertaken. But if Azerbaijan and their paid lobbyist decides to, focus on, let's say, 8,000 municipalities across the country, they're going to be able to get through the cracks somewhere or other. And I think that's just the nature of our political world. With more resources, we do more. But I think we're most proactive in areas where it matters most.
Bryan?
Very good points. And certainly I think we all agree it would have been better if it hadn't occurred in the first place. But let's also, give credit to the mayor, who has just confirmed this week to serve as Secretary of Labor in the Biden administration, for his apology and for his retraction. and of course the activism in the community. Not only the letter that NAASR sent to the mayor, but certainly Peter Katugin and Berj Najarian, Dr. Aram Kalajian, sorry, for their work too on this in making, that's part of it too, is the friendships, the networks, the relationships that are created. And Aram's right, you can't, if there's 8,000 municipalities across the country, we're not going to be able to necessarily have every single relationship there. But I think it points to a larger issue as well. And again, I know I referenced the genocide resolution back in 2000, because that was at that moment, a pretty pivotal moment. And we learned a lot of lessons from that time frame. But it was Congressman Ed Royce who later became the chair of that committee. During debate consideration of that resolution, he talked about how his father was in the 7th Army at Dachau in Germany when they had liberated the camps, concentration camps, and he talked about how his father had taken pictures, and then in 2000, he said, to this day, he carries on war correspondence with those who claim that the Holocaust never occurred. And so we know we have our work cut out for us. And I think ultimately, we need to, we can't take anything for granted. We need to remain vigilant. And I think education and awareness are certainly key. And then, we have the precedent now of the House and Senate in 2019, that historic passage of those resolutions, and we need to build upon that, and we look ahead to a strong, April 24th statement by the president, and we look ahead to when the Armenian genocide is universally taught in every classroom, across the country. I mean, think about it. Wouldn't that be just fantastic? And then, annually commemorated. Not only in the nation's capital, but in every let's go every municipality across the country. So I mean, I think we've done a lot of good work over these many decades. Certainly, there's much more work to be done. And just we talk about the Boston example, but then look at what happened in Portland. We have our work cut out for us in Portland. It certainly got the attention of the community there. They've weighed in. The mayor has gotten back. I don't think it's a satisfactory answer for any of us within the community. So again, we're going to be marshaling our forces there and looking at ways that we can have an impact there and make an example of it, so that in the future, when someone goes and Googles this issue, they're going to see, oh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't, do this. The mayor in Boston rescinded it. In Minnesota there was this, redo, and then Portland this happened. So I mean, we also need to use this as an opportunity to help educate people about what the situation is and what's going on. So I think these are all valuable learning lessons, and I think together we'll be able to continue to make important strides.
Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, just to thank Bryan and Aram for their advocacy work, and with regard to what one can do to sort of not be so reactive. I liked Henry's idea of really studying how it is that the denial is being produced, and really understanding sort of the mechanisms. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. And I mean, I don't know how one would do it, but it seems like getting to the heart of how it's produced, as with Turkey, makes a lot of sense. So that's just, my 2 cents.
Henry.
I guess a lot of what we've already discussed addresses this in different ways. So I think there's a lot of really, my co-panelists have made a lot of good points that are relevant. I would just add, it's really important that we understand very clearly what's happening now, because things are changing. Turkey, in one sense, has lost the denial campaign and it's won it. And Armenians have, I think, have built up a bit of a Maginot Line on the genocide issue that focuses more on, I will say, academic and rhetorical support. And as much as Bryan and Aram have really tried to push that through to actual policy change, a lot of times in the community, people are sort of satisfied with getting the proclamations, getting those things to the point where we're right on the verge of making it count. So when I say Turkey may have won denial, the fact is they could participate actively. Turkish soldiers could kill Armenians in 2020. They could do it with impunity. They could become peacekeepers in a conflict that they participated in against a group they committed genocide against and have never had any real accounting for, continued to deny. That shows how effectively they've made the denial issue not impact policy. And Aram said something years ago in relation to his lobbying or his work in Congress, where he said, it used to be when I talked to people in Congress, they would say, well, the Armenian genocide, what proof is there, all that kind of stuff. Now when I talk to them, I said, we know it happened. The question is, do we want that to impact our relationship with Turkey? And until the overcoming of denial does that, we're losing denial. On the other hand, Turkey has lost denial. In the scholarly realm, forget it. The Armenian genocide is now a referent case, probably second only to, or second or third only to the Holocaust and maybe Rwanda, as a referent case of genocide that everybody else uses as a model for understanding genocide. So that's gone. But I think what Turkey is doing right now is, for both of the reasons I just stated, partly because they feel an actual material impunity, a policy, a military, a political impunity to act, and also because they've lost denial on the scholarly level. They are latching on to Azerbaijan and the issue of Artsakh and the issue of removal of Armenians today as a new terrain. And because we're so geared toward genocide denial and not this whole other propaganda machine, we have not responded to it. The panzers have gone around the Maginot Line and are now on the other side. And we are trying to deal with that problem after it's a bit too late, but we can deal with it. Ultimately, I think Turkey is, I think a lot of what people are saying, originally I thought it was maybe an exaggeration. It is really true. Turkey is seeing an opportunity to win denial by actually finishing a big part of the genocide today. And that's the risk. And I would say, Azeris are getting duped in all of this. They were the only country in the post, sort of fall of the Soviet period to buy into the new pan-Turkism that Turkey peddled to all of the so-called Turkic republics. They're the only one that bought that. Everyone else is take a hike. We're our own countries will decide our own future. I think what we've seen now is the way that Azerbaijan won this war, despite its oil wealth, was because Turkey came in as a major part of the military and political and social media campaign and so forth. Turkey came in, and that was the difference. What that tells me is people in Azerbaijan, or the majority, hate Armenians so deeply. They hate them even more than they care about their own liberty, their own sovereignty, their own dignity as a people. They're willing to accept what is happening. They will eventually be a kind of a proxy client state of Turkey if they're not there already. Turkey wants that oil. It doesn't care about Azeri identity, except to the extent that it can assimilate it into Turkish identity. That's the game. It's very clear. If we understand that, we have the potential, I think those dynamics, we have the potential to find other places to intervene politically that can have real material effects, in my opinion.
Thank you. Okay, I'm scrolling through the questions, and there are many interesting and pertinent questions, some interesting and perhaps not pertinent, but interesting nonetheless. So let me see what we can do here while allowing our distinguished panelists to get some sleep tonight also. This is a question for Aram and Bryan, first of all. Do you think that given the fall 2019 congressional genocide recognition, as well as the latest pressing challenges over Artsakh and domestically in Armenia, that the full and enduring genocide recognition by the White House has a reduced salience as an issue at present?
I could jump in, or Bryan, feel free.
Go ahead, Aram.
Well, again, I would go back to the formula I shared before, which is that, the recognition has never been an end in itself. We seek recognition because recognition is very often, in a political context, a necessary condition for the remedies that we seek, right? We want the tobacco industry to acknowledge that cigarettes cause cancer because we want to reduce smoking. We want people to recognize the evils of apartheid because we want to end apartheid. We want people to see that pollution, creates global warming because we want to stop the pollution that creates global warming. It's a remedy-based system. So, yes, I would say that if our North Star is the survival of Armenia, well, the survival of Armenia, as Hank pointed out, took the viability of Armenia took a big hit in the last 6 months. So that is, just the reality we're facing. So nonetheless, I think the conditions have been created for the Biden administration like never before. The acts of Congress, the Library of Congress, the 49 states, the sort of the overwhelming scholarship. It's easier than ever before for this president, also given his own record and his own campaign statements, to get on the right side of the issue. And I would say the value is the validation for us, the check on, more importantly, the check on continued genocidal intent by Turkey and Azerbaijan toward the Armenians. I think that's if you're looking at the viability value of it, it's a check on the continuity of genocide on the part of Turkey and Azerbaijan toward Armenia. It's not like, oh, well, we have the history that we want written into the books that we want. It's much more going forward. Marc, I'll offer one thought, which is a little bit off topic, but it goes back to what Hank was saying about the victory or the failure of denial. And one of the questions, one of the points made in the question session or the question feature is by Ambassador John Evans, who about 15 years ago, ended his political career as a result of having spoken honestly about the Armenian genocide. And that is sort of like the exception that proves the rule. He, spoke honestly and about the Armenian genocide and saw his career ended for no other reason other than he spoke the truth about a known case of genocide. That's like remarkably bad on so many levels. I can't begin to tell you. The fact that President Obama condemned it and then pursued the same policy that got Ambassador Evans, essentially terminated from his job. That just, it's so bad on so many levels. Even worse at one level, I'll offer this as a personal view on this, is that not a single one of his colleagues, not a single member of the Foreign Service, his friends, then in the 15 years since, or even today, on hopefully the eve of a U.S. recognition of the Armenian genocide, not one stood up in the public arena and said, you got treated poorly, you got a raw deal, you spoke the truth, and you were unjustly punished for it. What does that say? I'm not going to answer that question for you. I'm just going to ask you, the viewers say, what does that say about Washington? What does that say about the depths, the roots that denial has sunk into this city? What does it say about a foreign government's ability to exercise a veto over American truth-telling? It's like epic in how troubling it is. I say that as someone, grew up in an Armenian family, but as, 100-year-old, my family's been in the U.S. now for 100 years, right? That kills me as an American, even maybe more than it does as an Armenian, to think that we could have this, let's say, somebody who was willing to take a courageous stand and who was punished for it, and no one came to his defense. It really it speaks volumes.
Bryan, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add that I don't think it reduces the salience. I think it actually, with Armenians targeted, in 1915, fast forward to today, Armenians targeted yet again. It makes it all the more relevant and important to affirm the Armenian genocide, and certainly for the Biden administration to follow the precedent that the Congress set. And as Aram said, Biden and Kamala Harris, their own record on this issue while they were serving in the United States Senate. So that, I think that is an important thing to factor in.
Thank you. There's a question about, which I'm going to adapt a little bit, that the question is, which Armenian organization or group speaks for all Armenians worldwide? And I think we know the answer to that is there isn't an Armenian organization or group that speaks for all Armenians worldwide. Is that a problem in your view?
Marc, I would turn the question around and say, is there a single constituency in the world that is represented uniformly by one organization? Like I know garden clubs that can't agree on who's going to speak for them. Like it's honest to God. Like if you look at every industry in DC, the dairy industry, the transportation industry, they're represented by multiple stakeholders with many, many shared names, but also, competitive interests. And that's part of living in a free society. The idea that, there should be one voice. I mean, like I would say, okay, the Chinese Communist Party is the final spokesperson for the Chinese government, period. And good for the Chinese Communist Party. They have a total monopoly on what is said for China. I don't want to be the Communist Party of China. And I think the Armenian community, by and large, has broad consensus on our priorities. You lock 100 Armenians in a room, and they might argue, about who's going to sit where and who's got precedence and who's higher in the pecking order. But finally, when they all sit down, take out a piece of paper, say, write down the 5 things that are important to you. They're pretty much going to write down the same things. And I think that's an enduring strength of our community. We fetishize the idea that we're not united, but the fact of the matter is, while there are personality issues and some parochialism that kind of, is distracting at times, at the core, there is a very powerful consensus in support of Artsakh, in support of justice for the genocide, in support of a stronger Armenia with deeper ties to the nations of the world. So I've never really worried about it at that level, because I just look around the world and I don't see any healthy system in which there's one final authority on any given constituency.
Well, there goes my suggestion to establish us as a steering committee for that organization, but I guess we can take that up another day.
However, I'm sure there are other points of view on that. So, I mean, there should be a debate on that as well.
If anyone feels differently, I would be happy to, we would be happy to hear from them.
I would only add that I love that feature of Armenian identity. And I think it's certainly not just Armenians who have that feature. I think it's great. You have multiple organizations. Yeah, a lot of them are working towards the same thing, but one may fit you better than another one. So you've got that option. You don't have to just fit one mold. We have different ways of thinking, different kinds of social perspectives and so forth. And I think that's great. I think that's a really healthy way for a group to be, because as soon as you start seeing enforced uniformity, I mean, we do see this within the Armenian community, who's Armenian, who's not, we see this a lot around LGBTQ plus issues, right? You can't be gay and be Armenian, all these kinds of ridiculous things. And that we don't want a community where we're forcing people to be a certain way. And I think it's wonderful. And the debates we have, I think, are incredibly healthy. I mean, when there is a consensus, it's reached because people have debated issues for years with deep conviction. And eventually that drives some really interesting synthesis and compromise and insight.
Thank you for giving the answer that we provided for you, Henry. That's good.
And let me just add to it, certainly one of the consequences of the genocide was that, Armenians were dispersed, throughout the world. And as a result, we have these wonderful, rich and vibrant communities. And I think it's very valuable that we have them. And I think it's important that, we learn from each pocket, if you will, and certainly that's something I think, with the Armenian Assembly, I know others as well, we try to embrace, everyone in common and shared goals. And I think that's really important. And, I look forward to more of these types of conversations.
So continuing on the organizational front, another question is, should Armenians establish an anti-defamation organization? Pointing out also that there is a new effort that has been started in California by Vic, I think it's Vic, is it Garami or Jarami? I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but it's been recently started. I don't know if that's exactly an anti-defamation organization or not, but anyway, setting that specific case aside, is this the time for such an organization to come into being, and how would it come into being, and what should it do? Henry.
Okay, I think that's a fascinating idea, and it speaks somewhat to the way in which, for instance, in the United States, Armenians assimilated, the immigrant experience of Armenians, the court cases moving Armenians from Oriental or Asian to white identity and so forth. And in a way, I mean, of course, Armenians face, we know the stories of the kinds of discrimination as immigrants that Armenians faced, and in some cases continue to face, even in the United States. But somehow that hasn't been, we've looked more toward sort of political organizations that have this, bigger vision, if I can almost say it that way. And they've done that work, right? I mean, ANC, Assembly, and so forth, they're on it, where there's denigration of Armenians, they're on that. But we haven't presented it that way for a long time. And I think part of that is Armenians don't want to be perceived as being victimized, in yet another context. There's only so many victimizations, a group can kind of handle. And the one that we focus on is the bigger one. But I think now that we're seeing a sort of convergence of maybe more historical anti-Armenianism that's not driven by Turkey or genocidal ideology and so forth, and the way that is serving Azeri propagandizing right now, I think it does open up the question of whether we need to address these things sort of together as one sort of converging phenomenon.
I would say that, like, if really thoughtful questions like that are along the lines of, like, should the Armenian community do A, B, or C? And as we discussed, there's no, like, governing body that just makes decisions. There's no Politburo that just decides these things. So it's sometimes, when we decide how to proceed collectively, it's sometimes as a result of a sort of a horizontal discussion or dialogue, where we discuss these things and collectively agree that this is the way to move forward. And that's often the case. And other times it's more of a vertical situation where it's like more of a free market situation, where the founders of NAASR decided some years ago, probably without everyone's approval, right? I'm sure they didn't get every single aspect of community life to say, give their checkbox to check the box off. But a sufficient number of people decided that NAASR was a good idea, and they worked really hard, and they built a critical mass, and that project has been sustained now for decades, for a half century. And in a sense, the answer to the question, should there be a group like NAASR, the answer is yes. The community has answered yes by sustaining the great work that's been done and that you're doing today. The same can be said of the Assembly and other groups. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be new groups, and there always should be new groups. But I'm not quite so certain that there's going to be like a meeting that takes place, in a boardroom somewhere that decides, well, we should do this, or this. Usually it's people, starting organizations, launching them. Some of them have more traction than others. Some of them fall just because they're not that well conceived, and others succeed. And that's kind of like a healthy thing. I think that we would want a community in which there is a little bit of people striving to offer the absolute best they have to the community, and the community responding. Our community life is, as we know maybe too well, is an opt-in society, right? We opt into being Armenian in America every single day, because we can opt out anytime we want. We can opt our kids out of Armenian school. We can opt out of Armenian church. We can opt out of Armenian language. We can do, we're an opt-out, opt-in society. And the same can be said of our organization. So if people opt in as donors, as activists, as supporters, as volunteers, then that particular effort prospers. And if not, they don't. And I think that's they call it sometimes creative disruption. I'm not sure that's a good phrase or not. But I think about, like, when people say things like, well, we should do this, it first implies that there's just sort of some distinct we. And the second is, don't ask if we should do this, do this, right? Get out there and do it. Like I face, criticism all the time saying, well, ANC is falling short here and there. It's like, well, we'll try to do better, but don't think for a moment that you can't do this yourself. And if you've got a better model to offer, then offer that model, right? And don't hesitate for one moment out of deference to any sort of legacy role that we may have. I would say that's I think a healthy community.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It's an interesting, thoughtful question here for each of you. The essence of which is, could you please share a success story you have of reaching out to an individual, a scholar, a politician, anyone, to present them with the truth about whether it's the Armenian genocide or about Armenia's history and anything, any aspect of the work you're engaged in, where you have seen someone through your actions move from a place of, let's say, ignorance and denial to a place of knowledge and truth. Christina.
Sorry. Sure.
Well, I don't know if I can say that the place was of denial, but it's important, I think, to say that when I teach Armenian art and architecture at Tufts, which I do every semester, and I'll have sometimes 100 students, and I teach about these issues. So the extent to which the monuments are in the crosshairs, and these are students who know nothing about Armenia. They know nothing. This is completely new to them, and so they understand, because they're coming to this from maybe backgrounds that aren't even art history. Maybe it's econ or political science or whatever, but they understand the issues, and actually the monuments can be very useful ways for them to learn about how all these issues are entangled: economics, diplomacy, politics, history. And so whether or not I changed their minds, or whether they had a view that I somehow countered, I don't know, but I know that it's possible to inform them in good numbers, and to do that regularly. And so that's maybe not a strategy, but it happens through teaching. And so that's, and I'm sure I speak for others of us who teach, that regularly happens. And it happens because there is scholarship. It's not just that scholarship is lying there. We're teaching with it, and we're showing the images, showing the before and afters, talking about the archaeology. So I think, just to sort of say again, that success story, I think, is quite it's not a rarity. I think it's happening more than maybe we notice, at least in the context of the classroom. But.
Thank you. Bryan.
Sure. And since it's mostly, not mostly, but since Massachusetts crowd to a certain extent, I was just recalling, and there's lots of different ones. There's also some not so fun ones, in moving into a neighborhood, and where do you work? And, Armenian Assembly of America, Albanian, what, mission something? I can't tell you how many times I've had to, correct or say it again nicely where I'm working. And then some of the people that I've met, some have, I remember being on a plane one time, and their reference point, they were in law school, and the reference point was, keeping up with the Kardashians. And so they knew all about the Armenian genocide through that. To others that had no clue, and or former defense contractors, that type of thing, who had all of these, I've heard these lines before. why do we care about something that happened, 85 years ago type of thing. So there's all that. But the one from Massachusetts, I remember meeting with Congressman Barney Frank's office, and I had set it up with the legislative assistant, trying to get the congressman to co-sponsor the bill. And I meet the legislative assistant in their office, and we're waiting. I said, okay, the congressman's ready to see you. And normally, whoever the aide is comes in with you. So he opens the door to the congressman's office, and then he closes the door, but he's not in the meeting. He closed the door behind me. So I'm like, this is a little weird. And it's just me and the congressman. I sit down, hi, Congressman, how are you? And and he goes, he says, okay, go. And so I start explaining why I'm here, what we're doing. And he goes, okay, I'll co-sponsor the bill. Anything else? And he's already on the caucus and everything. And so no, Congressman, that's what I was here for today. We very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. And that was the end of the meeting. And it was a great meeting. Maybe he already had his mind made up. He's from Massachusetts, so it was easy, but it was just this weird situation where, and Aram knows too, usually if you're, working with a staff person, you would think that the staff person would then come into the meeting with you. So it was just one of those great meetings. Anyway, that's what I'm recalling right now.
Henry or Aram?
Well,
Aram.
You want to go? Yeah.
Sorry, Hank. Okay, I'll just be real quick. You may have noticed that over the last several months, starting actually in September, October, that Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute has been one of the most articulate analysts of the situation in the Caucasus. He traveled to Artsakh in November and has written, I think, in a very sympathetic manner that didn't characterize his previous writings. I think
it was not always so. Yes.
It was not always so. Yes. And I've spoken on many panels with him. I think Bryan has as well. And one thing I came away from our discussions, but also how he's moved on these issues, is that sometimes it is not about people being bought and paid for, and it's not about some cynical ulterior motive or some kind of evil intent. Sometimes it's just a matter of people taking another look at things. And I think that maybe he had put the Armenian issue in a certain box based on other regional sort of larger regional paradigm, but when he was able to look at the Armenian issue maybe more on its own merits, he came away thinking, well, no, the folks in Artsakh have a legitimate case to liberty, and Azerbaijan is actually the aggressive party here, and he's emerged, I think, as a really, really important voice in Washington. But if you had asked Bryan or I if that might be the case a year ago, I think we probably would have bet our mortgages against that. But as it turns out, he's really emerged as a very, very thoughtful writer, and I give him a lot of credit for being willing to look at his previous thinking on the issue and revising it based on his sort of new appreciation of the facts.
Right.
I would actually start by flipping that around a little bit and just giving an example of how I've been changed by people's thinking. I'm thinking of, for instance, I've had a really nice connection with Taner Akşam for many years, and the things he's written, the ways he's approached things, have actually really influenced a lot of thinking on a number of issues for me, and gotten me over, I think, some resistance, internal resistance, some narrow thinking and so forth. And so I think we're all, that can be a benefit to all of us. So I would say that. The flip side, I would just say one time, sometime after the reparations report that I had been co-authored in 2015 came out, a scholar, Armenian scholar, who is quite, I think, very, very impressive, has done a lot of impressive work, very sharp guy, came up to me, we ran into each other, and he said, I didn't used to support reparations. I read your report, now I support it. And that was like the nicest. I was like, oh my God, it actually had an effect. This is great. And I appreciated that a lot. So sometimes even within our own community, it can be helpful to talk about issues because we never know what kind of influence those discussions can have.
And I since I know Tanner is watching tonight, that'll make him especially happy, Henry. So that's good.
Didn't really. Hey, Tanner, how you doing?
So as much as I hate to do this, I want to make this the last question because I know there are several dozen here that are deserving of attention, and you all see them, you all have them, you see that these are thoughtful and intelligent questions, and I thank everyone for submitting them. And if you want to follow up with your specific question, if it was not addressed to any of these good people, I'm sure they will be very happy to try to address them. I hope so, because I just said so publicly. So the question is this, and it's been touched on a little bit in some of the comments, but it's expressing frustration and questioning why the diaspora has focused so much on the genocide and has done much less to bring attention or recognition to recent atrocities. Has the focus on the genocide that has existed for however long we want to say that it's existed, hindered us today in terms of being able to address with similar knowledge base and competence issues that are arising around current day Armenia and Artsakh? You can agree or disagree.
I would disagree. I would disagree with that. I think that this idea about sort of like the fungibility of issues is like a fiction. It's not as though X units of attention to this is equal to X units of attention to that. As it turns out, the Armenian genocide has, relative to other Armenian issues, vast public awareness. It is commonly accepted historical fact outside of the political realm. It is in many ways our political introduction to a great many figures across American civil society. It elevates all Armenian issues, right? Because it has such resonance in the world, and it's such 49 U.S. states, the Library of Congress, all the resolutions over the years, the fights, the Turkish lobbying, right? These things have elevated Armenian issues to a level in the American political context that simply would not have been possible if we had just said, "Oh, that's history. Leave it aside. Let's just talk about A, B, or C. Let's talk about Artsakh or not." So the genocide issue is an important issue. It frames, I think, certainly the Artsakh issue in terms of genocidal continuity. I've never really bought into that. I also am I also tend to believe that the genocide issue is like a powerful wedge issue in Washington because it is so unassailable on a factual basis and so unassailable on a moral basis, but so utterly inconvenient on a geopolitical basis that it has just no end of enemies in this capital, no end of enemies. So, this speaks to Ambassador Evans not having a single one of his colleagues, single one, say one nice word about him, one word in his defense, right? Because this establishment considers this an inconvenient genocide. I think that's Robertson's phrase. It's a highly inconvenient genocide, right? So the fact of the matter is that then engenders an attack. And the attack is something like the false choice of, well, you care about the past, you don't care about the future. You care about the genocide, you don't care about the Republic. You care about 1915, you don't care about 2020. These are I think they're cheap shots, and I think they also reflect a much more of an American way of thinking, which is only look forward, only look forward. Countries like Armenia, people like the Armenians don't have the luxury of just dismissing the past and saying, well, whatever happened, let's move forward, think about tomorrow. Well, justice actually for past crimes is an important part of Armenia's viability going forward. It is an important part of Armenia's viability going forward. So these attacks on you care too much about genocide, first of all, I don't think it's possible to care too much about a genocide. I don't think the attempted and ongoing destruction of the Armenian people should in any way be downgraded on any level. Does that mean we shouldn't focus like a laser beam on Artsakh, Armenian security, the Armenian homeland survival? Of course we should. But I think we just have to kind of I would sort of reject out of hand this idea of you folks care too much about the genocide issue, and as a result, we didn't devote sufficient energy to Artsakh or Armenia or other things, which we absolutely do. Look at our agenda on any given day, follow our social media feed, read any of the scholarship that's been drafted over the years about our work, whether it's the assemblies or the ANC. There's been a lot of work on Artsakh, on the aid program to Artsakh, on Section 907, on blocking the Bryan nomination, on the Royce Angle initiatives. I could go on and on. On a day-to-day basis, Artsakh has been very, very front and center, and certainly not suffered at all at the expense of any other issue.
Anyone else?
I would just reiterate what we discussed before, that they're related issues. It's not an either or. I think Aram has done a great job of talking about it. And then I would just add, I noticed Pam Steiner had made a comment about collective trauma, which I think is really important to look at. And I think, in groups with a history of victimization, self-blame is one of the reactions, right? Because you don't have the power to change the objective circumstances. When you internalize the effects of what you've experienced, that's one of the ways that it comes out. And so we have to be careful. I think Aram had said it before. If someone has a criticism, that's great. Step up and do your thing. And too often we think just making a criticism, it feels somehow cathartic when in fact it's really not moving us or anybody forward. So I think that may be something to keep in mind as well.
Christina, Bryan.
Unless Christina wants to go, I'll defer to her first.
You're unmuted, so we'll give it to you.
Oh, no, she unmuted now. Now I have to defer. I'm deferring.
Causing trouble.
Please, Christina.
What can I add? Just to take what Aram said and go backward in time. There's no, you could say the same thing about, you focus, too much on the genocide and not on what came before, which is this incredibly rich history. But you can't really study the medieval monuments without knowing their modern fate. It doesn't make sense. It affects all kinds of issues related to access and to their condition. Can't answer any questions about them without sort of understanding what happened to them in the 20th century. So that was just something to add to that question.
Yeah, history and contemporary issues aren't detachable units that can be sort of broken off from each other and looked at separately. They're all connected to each other, and certainly issues like the Armenian genocide and what's happening today are very closely connected. That's my piece. So, Bryan, please.
Thanks, Marc, and thanks to all the panelists too for the awesome insights and commentary throughout the night, including on this last and ending question, I guess, as we go look probably to have some dinner. It is true. Certainly, there are a lot of issues before us, and I've heard that before too. You all are so focused on the Armenian genocide and what about Armenia today and bread on the table and things like that. And I think collectively, if you look at, as Aram was saying, some of the other work, and we just had basically a week-long advocacy conference, and we touched on so many issues: preservation of cultural heritage, defending human rights, the issue of POWs, congressional priorities, aid to Armenia, aid to Artsakh, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously the effort by Chairman Menendez with the 38 senators, including the chairman, sending to President Biden, asking Biden to affirm the Armenian genocide. There's a host of issues that we're always working on. And I wouldn't say that one is exclusive to the other, but if a resolution is pending before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the Armenian genocide, we're not going to say, oh, well, today we're focused on appropriations, so we're not going to work on this issue, and vice versa. When the appropriations process is starting, so we're very, very much at front and center in terms of advocating for robust assistance to help the Armenian people. So there are a lot of issues, and I think it doesn't do it justice in the little bit of time we have left to try to have them compete against one another. They're all important, and I think we focus on all these aspects and elements. And I think in terms of the Armenian genocide, and especially with a new Congress and new administration, and with the new administration really focused on, and you've seen the Secretary of State say it repeatedly, that one of their guiding principles is helping democracies and standing up for human rights. Now is a perfect time to be talking about this issue. And I know this panel may have been overly emphasizing it to maybe the exclusion of talking about other issues, but that's just how this night unfolded, I think. But no, there's a lot of issues to talk about and ways that we can all help Artsakh, help Armenia, and also make sure that we're standing for the truth at the same time.
Thank you. And yes, I trust it's understood that this was not intended to be and could not be an exhaustive and comprehensive treatment of all of the issues facing Armenia and Armenians today, obviously. Although a pretty wide, swath of ground was covered. So I really appreciate Bryan, Aram, Henry, and Christina for taking a good chunk of your time and sharing your knowledge and your insights with us, and appreciate the audience for hanging with us throughout a long program, and for submitting questions. And I would say it's definitely a cliche, but you can help. One way you can help certainly is by getting involved with these organizations, involved with these issues, involved with scholarship, supporting the work that's being done. And as Aram said, maybe it means starting a new organization or a new group to do something, doing what you can, because there's a lot to be done. And NAASR, ANC, AAA, International Association of Genocide Scholars, everybody else can't do everything. We need a lot of help. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the Gulbenkian Foundation for supporting the program. And again, to all of you on the panel, thank you for your very valuable time. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.